Welcome to the Fantasy Football Strategy Guide. This is Paul Miller, and I'm sitting in with Brian Christiana and Dylan Kleintop for our second edition of the 2018 Fantasy Football Strategy Guide. Welcome back to the show, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, again.
Certainly not a problem. I'm so glad that you guys are here on this beautiful morning. So we've learned a lot in the last month. It was about 2 weeks before the fantasy season started that we had our first episode of the podcast, and we're going to structure it a lot like we did the first time. We're going to talk about our new top 20 players that we've ranked. We're going to talk about a couple waiver wire targets you might want to take a look at in your waiver wire this week. We're also going to talk about a few injury concerns and who might be the replacement for those individuals, and then we'll talk surprises and busts going forward. So, gentlemen, I think we're going to start off with our new top 20. We can read through some of these, but talk to me a little bit about some of your big movers from your original top 20. Dylan, who were some people that you had either moving up, moving down, just kind of some of the people that you kind of readjusted after we saw what's going on in the first 2 weeks of the season?
Okay, well, someone that jumped into my top five, Tyreek Hill. He's had an excellent start to the season. The first week, he had like 43 points. I remember the kid I was playing against, he had Tyreek Hill, and he just blew me out the water with Tyreek Hill. One person that I took out of my top five and moved him down, he's still in the top 10, Selam Barkley. Although he's had a decent start to the season, like he's scored touchdowns, he's done well. I just don't think, compared to my top five, he hasn't put up the number of points that he should to be in my top five. And another player that actually wasn't even on my top 20 list, and you're going to be surprised by this, he's in the top 10, Patrick Mahomes. Not a rookie quarterback, it's his second year, but it's his first year playing. He's off to an amazing start, like 6 touchdowns, probably more. I think it's like 9 touchdowns.
How about 10? How about 10?
10 touchdowns? Yeah, that's crazy for the first 2 games. I had him as a sleeper. I mean, he's just shown up, and I'm really impressed by what he's doing.
What's interesting about Mahomes is I think everybody knew that the talent was there, but it's insane how many touchdowns he's had. I mean, he set an NFL record for number of touchdowns in the first 2 weeks of a season. I mean, that's the real deal. I think part of the reason that people weren't a little higher on Mahomes coming into the season was just the fact that they'd only ever seen him play one game. I mean, we say all these top quarterbacks coming out of the draft are, we hope that they're going to be big stars. But at the same time, he does have a good running game. He's got some seriously good receivers. I mean, he's got what a lot of these other quarterbacks coming out of the draft just do not have. So I do think that that's interesting that you would go all the way to a top 5 player. I don't even have one quarterback in my top 20 at this point. So interesting that you say that. Brian, who are some people that you had moving either up or down in your top 20?
Okay, so I moved him up a lot, and that's Melvin Gordon for the Chargers. He's been really active in the passing game for the Chargers, and then he's been having a lot of touchdowns. James Conner for Pittsburgh, another great player that they're using in the absence of Le'Veon Bell. Zach Ertz is also, and I include him in my top 20. I didn't include him at all earlier, but he's getting a lot of catches and the balls being thrown to him. We'll see how it is now with Carson Wentz coming back this week. Golden Tate for Detroit, another player getting a lot of passes thrown to him. I wasn't really high on him before, and you agreed with me on this, but Christian McCaffrey, he's having a good start.
I've come around on Christian McCaffrey. I've seen a couple of the games that he's played, and just in a PPR league, when the guy's getting 10-plus receptions every game, you've got those 10 points, you've got maybe another 8, 10 for 80, and then you have his rushing, and that's not even counting his touchdowns. McCaffrey, at this point, he's PPR gold. So you had some big movers there. Golden Tate in your top 20. I'm really surprised by that. Why are you so high on Tate?
Well, I mean, the Detroit Lions, we all know, they've always been a pass-first team with Matthew Stafford being there. Theo Riddick is the running back with LeGarrette Blount. And Golden Tate, I mean, Marvin Jones isn't having the best of seasons so far, so Golden Tate has been getting a lot of the ball, has been getting the ball thrown a lot to him, and Eric Ebron not being there, so.
I think it's interesting, too, though, Brian. Don't forget about Kenny Galladay, who's a third stringer there. And while they don't necessarily have a tight end, I think Galladay is the guy that I want there. I'm not saying in a draft, in a redraft at this point, I would take him over a Golden Tate, but I would definitely take him over Marvin Jones, that's for sure. So I think the fact that they've got 3 big weapons that they use kind of takes away a little bit from a guy like Golden Tate. So I'm very interested that you said that. Some of the people that I had moving, one person we didn't mention here, and I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this player, is Le'Veon Bell. Where do you guys have him in your top 20, or do you have him in your top 20 at all?
I don't even have him in my top 20.
I didn't include him, no. Yeah, no.
So that's an interesting point here because, you've got people like Earl Thomas who held out, hoping for a new deal or trade, didn't get that, came back. Khalil Mack was going to hold out, but was traded. You can't really trade Bell, and I've even heard some people with the false notion that, they'll sign him. Well, Le'Veon Bell really doesn't have any leverage. He cannot be signed because he was franchised. A lot of people don't understand that. Khalil Mack was not franchised. Khalil Mack was in the last deal of his last year of his rookie deal. Same thing with Odell Beckham. They were in the last year of their rookie deal. They can be signed to an extension. Once you franchise someone, once that July deadline comes, you cannot re-sign them until the next offseason, which means Le'Veon Bell cannot be or get any type of extension from the Steelers at this point. So really, he's just losing his own money. I guess I'm not really even sure what he's holding out for. He says that it's due to injury. He doesn't want to risk injury, which I understand. But at the same time, he's losing very close to $900,000 every game he doesn't play.
That's a lot of money.
And I do remember him saying something along the lines of, he was concerned that they were going to use him too much. They were going to utilize him a little bit too much in the offense. So that's interesting, but how long is he really going to hold out for? I mean, let's be honest.
I think with James Conner playing as good as he is, if Le'Veon does come back and play, I don't think Le'Veon will still get majority of the workload, but he won't be utilized as much as he thinks he will be, especially with James Conner. He's a good running back.
Well, Conner played well in the first game, but then in the last game against Kansas City when they went down early, he's just not that big of a factor out of the backfield catching passes as Bell is. So I'm interested to see how this all unfolds. Pure speculation here. No information going on. I bet he's back in 2 weeks. I bet he sits one more week and then he's back, and then they have a bye week coming up as well.
I hope so. The league I have James Conner, and I also have Mark Ingram, so I hope that, yeah.
Well, and that's the thing too. Anybody who drafted Le'Veon Bell should have had James Conner on their team, especially with the question marks coming into the season. I've got Le'Veon Bell at number 8, and I'm actually probably a little low on him for a couple reasons that I'll talk about here in just a minute. My new number 1 player, and I'm almost positive we're all the same here. It's got to be Todd Gurley.
That's who I have.
I don't see how anybody at this point could not put Gurley at number 1. He's actually number 3 in points with 56. Melvin Gordon with 58, and Alvin Kamara with 61. So that's very interesting too. Didn't really move a lot on Kamara. I had Kamara at 10 in the preseason ranks. I have him at 9 here. He's had 2 solid games, of course, 1 excellent game and 1 average game for Kamara. My concern with Kamara and why I didn't move him up a little further, and I love Kamara, but I think that when Ingram does come back, I think that Kamara's role kind of is reduced slightly. Although you have to admit, New Orleans has not had a very good start to the season, taking a big loss in Tampa Bay and then nearly losing to the Browns.
Yeah.
The Browns were one of 3 or 4 field goals away that were missed by their kicker from beating the Saints. What's going on with the Saints at this point?
I don't know, but I'm glad I'm not the Browns kicker right now. He missed the field goal against the Steelers, missed the field goal against the Saints. I think he's out of a job.
Yes, he's definitely out of a job.
Yeah.
They've moved on from him. They signed a rookie kicker on Monday. So I do think it's interesting. I'd be careful. So when we're talking about our top 20 listeners, we're talking about if we were starting a new league and the draft was today, I would absolutely still take Le'Veon Bell in the first round. You guys mean to tell me you're sitting there like the 8, 9, 10 pick, you're not going to take Bell?
Nope.
I'm very surprised by that.
I would. Well, talking about the Saints, I'm really big on Michael Thomas this year.
And I'm glad you brought that up, too. I actually have moved Michael Thomas. Preseason, I had him 16. I've moved him all the way up to number 7.
He's having a good, solid year so far.
Here's something I have a lot of question about. Why in the world has Cam Meredith been inactive? He's been a healthy scratch, and so it's basically Thomas and Ted Ginn and a couple of rookie second-year guys.
That's fine with me.
They don't have much of a tight end situation. Kamara's getting a lot of run out of the backfield. Number 1 in points, Michael Thomas by 7, and 14 up on the number 3 wide receiver, and this will blow your mind. Number 3 wide receiver in points, Desean Jackson. Who would have known that Desean Jackson would be up there? And Galladay is definitely in the top 20 as well. So
I have a question for you guys.
Yeah.
Where do you have Gronk? I don't even have him in my top 20.
I have him at 18. I mean, I still have him included in my top 20. I mean, right now Hogan's not really. I mean, Hogan had a good week 2, but week 1 wasn't there, and Gronk had a really good week 1.
Thing about Gronk, I also have him at 18, Brian. The thing about Gronk, in my personal opinion, Dylan, is that tight end is so thin this year. Obviously, Kelsey's still there, but he put up a 1-point effort in a PPR league week 1. Now, yes, he came back. Guys, this is what's really going to blow your mind. The number 1 tight end in fantasy right now, Jared Cook. If you would have, I'd have paid you $1 million if you'd have told me that and that wouldn't happen. A lot of, Ertz is playing pretty well, but hasn't found the end zone this year. Kelsey literally took a 1 in PPR and a 0 in standard week 1. Jesse James is done well. I think he's a guy, but again, it's so thin from week to week. I mean, behind Gronk and Kelsey, there's a huge drop off to Jordan Reed, Ingram, even Doyle. I mean, I'm going to be the first to admit I really missed the mark on Jack Doyle. He was one of my sleepers. I got him in almost every league I had. I'm very surprised that he's been performing so poor. Only 9 catches for 80 yards and a fumble.
Well, look at Kelsey's week 1.
Yeah.
One reception, 6 yards.
And then last week he came back with
a lot.
Let's see, 9 for 109 and 2 touchdowns. So,
yeah.
I mean, as long as Mahomes keeps going at the rate he is, he's got to be at least their 1A target. I mean, Tyreek Hill's going to get the ball. Sammy Watkins going to get the ball. Hunt out of the backfield. I don't know. I'm still skeptical. I have Kelsey in the league, and I'm actually trying to trade him right
Kelsey.
now. Yeah, because I'm just not that high on him, and I think I can get a pretty high return back.
I included Cousins in mine, though, just to
in your top 20.
Yeah, I like what he's doing right now with Diggs and Thielen. I like what their team is doing.
Well, he's the number 3 overall quarterback. Does have 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception, and does rush the ball a little bit. It looks like he's 5th in quarterback rushing yards, which is pretty interesting. Cousins has always been a mobile guy. He's always going to get you some rushing yards, and I think he'll have some rushing touchdowns this year too. Very interesting, though, with Cousins. Very, really back and forth game between Green Bay and Minnesota. A couple other guys I want to take a look at here. Interested to hear where you guys have people maybe in the second half of your top 20. A guy like Kareem Hunt. What are your thoughts on Kareem Hunt, gentlemen?
I like Kareem Hunt. He's not a bad player. He's a good fit for the Kansas City offense. I mean, they're obviously this past game it was 40. They scored 42 points on Pittsburgh, and Mahomes was accounted for 6 of the touchdowns. So.
Kareem Hunt only with 20 fantasy points thus far. 34 carries, 124 yards, and only 1 catch out of the backfield. That's very surprising. Not seeing a lot of Spencer Ware, so I suppose that it's just one of those things, and they were just throwing the ball so much. But who's to say that this isn't who the Chiefs are? I mean, I was actually kind of wary to put him. I have him at 14. I was actually pretty wary to put him there. He may even fall out of my top 20 if he doesn't turn things around here over the next few weeks.
At 14, I have OBJ.
And Beckham, again, my concern with Beckham, and I have him at 13, he's obviously a great talent, but Eli Manning, and I'm going to own up on this one too, he was another one of the sleepers I had on. He just looks awful. Did you guys watch the game?
Yeah, I think the line is the problem. The first 2 plays of the game against Jacksonville, it was tripping and holding on the same lineman, Eric Flowers, out of Miami. He is, in my opinion, the worst lineman in the NFL.
And I'm pretty sure that he is now injured, and I don't know what his injury status is as we record this, so maybe you're going to get your wish there. And
they spent a first-round draft pick on him, and he's doing nothing.
I'm just blown away by how poor. This goes back to your point about Saquon Barkley. I mean, he's looking good, but if you have nowhere to run, what are you going to do? You know, and it seems like it's been difficult for them to get going thus far. Guys, one final, before we move on out of our top 20, one final person that's maybe toward the bottom end of your top 20 that's sort of that might be a surprise to some of the listeners.
Well, I think everyone's forgetting about the best quarterback in the league right now, Ryan Fitzpatrick. I mean, he's in my top 20, and he's down at 16, but he's putting on a show out there.
Well, he's the number one player in fantasy at this point, and it's not like they played horrible defenses either. Everybody was high on the Saints, including me, on their defense coming into this year. And if anybody watched the opening game of the season with the Eagles and the Falcons, knows that the Eagles' defense is the real deal. Obviously, they went and beat up on the Eagles pretty good this week. So hard to say what happens to Fitzpatrick. I mean, he's the number one player in all of fantasy at this point after 2 weeks. What do you do here? If you have him, do you try to trade him for something? Do you hang on to him? Do you roll the dice? Is he going to lose his job to Jameis Winston? What's their thoughts from the Tampa Bay perspective? They have no running game. They don't have much of a defense. Their I believe second round pick, Ronald Jones, hasn't even played. I'm not really sure what's going on there, but they seem to have something with Fitzpatrick.
I would when Jameis Winston comes back, I would just keep what they have going. I like Jameis Winston, but what Fitzpatrick is doing right now is good for their team. Just keep rolling the dice with him.
But, I mean, how long of a leash does he have?
But that's the thing. It all depends.
Because, I mean, if he has one bad game, is he going to get pulled for Jameis Winston? I mean, if he has 4 good games and 1 bad game, is he all of a sudden going to lose his job? I mean, that's why I think that's my skepticism there, Dylan. If I'm in a redraft leagues going into week 3 and I'm in the second round, I'm not going to pull the trigger on Fitzpatrick. Now, he clearly does deserve some type of discussion, and if he's in your league, you certainly should pick him up. I'm actually in a league where he's still available, so I'm probably going to have to put in a waiver claim on him, even though I don't need a quarterback. But I think that's interesting. Brian, anybody that makes your top 20 that maybe might surprise the listeners a little bit?
I had him ranked lower last time, but I mean, I have Mike Evans in there. I mean, you said Desean Jackson's the third receiver in fantasy, but Mike Evans is still in there.
Well, and even Goodwin has played very well. Mike Evans comes in at number 4. He's tied with Stephon Diggs at 4, 50 points overall so far. 17 catches, 230 yards, 2 touchdowns, 19 targets. Does have a fumble, but Mike Evans just as solid as ever. The question is, last year Mike Evans struggled with Jameis Winston. Might it be just a situation where Fitzpatrick and him have a very strong rapport, or is it just that he's healthy?
There could be both. They both can factor into that. I mean, when you're playing, obviously, I mean, we all know when you're healthy, you obviously are faster, stronger. But it seems like with the run, Jameis Winston is a run-first quarterback, where Ryan Fitzpatrick is a drop-back quarterback where he likes to throw the ball. So, I mean, that could be it. Mike Evans is a deep threat receiver, so I think it has a little bit to do with both.
Well, I'm just going to we can just read off our top 10s, gentlemen, just so everybody knows where we stand, and then we'll move on to the next segment. I'm going to go first. At number 1, I have Gurley. Number 2, Zeke Elliott. Number 3, Antonio Brown. Number 4, David Johnson. 5, Saquon Barkley. I'm still high on Dalvin Cook. He did leave Week 2's game with a potential hamstring injury, but everything looks good on him. 7, Michael Thomas. 8, Le'Veon Bell. Number 9, Alvin Kamara. And number 10, DeAndre Hopkins. Dylan?
All right, I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Number 1, I got Alvin Kamara. Number 2, I got Todd Gurley. 3, Tyreek Hill. 4, AB. 5, I have Michael Thomas. 6, I have AJ Green. 7, Saquon Barkley. 8, Patrick Mahomes. 9, Adam Thielen. And 10, Ezekiel Elliott.
So I have met 2 and you have met 10. I'm surprised by that. There's just, in my opinion, there's just not that many backs that are going to have the full workload. Brian?
All right, so number 1 is Gurley. 2, I have Melvin Gordon. 3, Kamara. 4, Michael Thomas, so teammates back-to-back. Then I went with Zeke at 5. I have 6, I have James Conner. like we talked about earlier. 7, I went with Antonio Brown. 8, AJ Green. 9, Keenan Allen. And 10, Stefan Diggs.
All right. One final person I just wanted to mention, get your thoughts on, and I had this guy just sneak into my top 20, is Miami Dolphins running back Kenyon Drake.
He's having a great season.
Who I actually put as my number 2 biggest bust during our preseason podcast. He's hanging in there. He is right now at only 26 points, but he does have 25 carries, 101 yards, but he has 7 catches out of the backfield, which is respectable.
That's a point per reception.
He's getting the work, and while Frank Gore is still there, and Frank Gore has been involved, I do think that I like the upside on him just enough to sneak him in at number 20.
Well, congratulations, Frank Gore. He's now number 4 on the all-time rushing list.
Yes, and you know, I was listening to the radio coming in this morning. Frank Gore hasn't missed a game since 2010.
Good for him.
How insane is that in the day and age of guys getting nicked up and as running backs? So, hey, why not? So, interesting. Keep an eye on Kenyon Drake going forward. We're going to round out this segment of the podcast with something that I want to make sure that we do on every single podcast, and that's taking a look at some waiver wire players. Now, typically for us to talk about them, they've got to be available in about 50% of leagues. Really, though, going forward, I'd like us to take a little bit deeper of a dive, some more speculative ads, maybe in the 20 to 25% area going forward. But today, I'd ask everybody to come up with a couple of waiver wire players to target going into week number 3. So, Dylan, let's talk about one of your players on that list.
All right. I have Matt Breida, running back from the 49ers.
What's interesting about Breida, and he's certainly in the top 12-ish of running backs, did have a big game last week, but I think what's interesting is obviously McKinnon got hurt early in the season, and that was sort of the question mark going into week 1 was how is this going to shake out? Alfred Morris, Breida, they have some other guys there too, but I do think after last week, I think this is Breida's job. Keep in mind, though, Alfred Morris still had double-digit carries last week. So I don't know that it's going to be a full-on, if it's going to be a committee or if it's going to be Breida's job. I just don't know.
Might be a good place to put him at the flex.
And Breida currently is owned in 62% of leagues. Both weeks, 11 carries, though. Interestingly enough, it does not appear that he's had any receptions. Okay, 4 receptions for 26 yards. So he's not as involved in the passing game as I think we originally thought. But definitely, if he's available, pick up Matt Breida going into week 3. Brian, someone from your list.
Aquiline Cole from the Jacksonville Jaguars, wide receiver.
One thing about some of these Jags receivers is they're all getting involved here. You've got guys like Dante Moncrief, they've got Safarian Jenkins,
D.D. Westbrook.
And it's not like Blake Bortles is the most proficient and prolific passer. Aquiline Cole still through 2 weeks, 10 catches, 170 yards and a touchdown. Respectable, certainly startable. Let's see what Aquiline Cole is owned in 48.5% of leagues. So that's, again, certainly a potential waiver wire person.
I started him this past week, and he ended up getting around 24.5 points.
So somebody that I wanted to talk about is somebody who I was very impressed by in some of the games that I've seen so far is Quincy Enunwa from the New York Jets. While Enunwa, it could be said, it's not like he's in the best offense in the league. I mean, Darnold hasn't looked bad. He did miss Enunwa. I don't know if you guys saw this play. There isn't anyone within 10 yards of Enunwa, and Darnold airmailed it out of the back of the end zone. Or else his game would have been even bigger. But through 2 weeks, first week he had 18 points. Week 2 he had 16 points. And again, if he would have caught that touchdown pass, it would have been another 30 yards and a touchdown. So I do think Enunwa is the number 1 target there in New York. So I think that would be an interesting, and he's currently owned in 56% of leagues. So definitely some options there. How about some deeper dives here, guys? Who are some of the other players that maybe, owned in less leagues, but people who might come in handy going forward?
O.J. Howard.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I had O.J. Howard as well.
Yes, I did too.
Tight end for the Bucks. And what really has kind of hurt me thus far in our league that we're playing in is the fact that I had Cameron Brate. Well, that's what's interesting about O.J. Howard. Coming into this year, even last year when they drafted him, Brate was still the go-to number one tight end in Tampa. And now that O.J. Howard's kind of moved into his second year, Cameron Brate's done almost nothing. Keep in mind, though, O.J. Howard's only had 5 receptions this season. I do think it's a step in the right direction, and Cameron Brate, 0 catches. So at this point, it does appear that Howard is the go-to guy at tight end. As long as Fitzpatrick's a part of this, maybe Winston comes back, maybe Brate gets more involved. But with as thin as tight end is, I really think that O.J. Howard is a very interesting add at tight end going forward. Especially, hey, we have some bye weeks starting in week 4. So definitely keep an eye on when your players are going on a bye. I do know that the Saints go on their bye week 6. So that's something to keep in mind too. So Ingram will come back for week 5, and then they'll have a bye for week 6, and then he'll come back for week 7. So interesting to see how that shakes out. One person I have here that I wanted to chat about in a couple different ways is Brandon Marshall for Seattle. While Lockett, after the Monday night game, did get some targets, Marshall still finished 4 catches for 48 yards. But the main reason I think about Brandon Marshall, Baldwin, it's very unclear what his situation is. He came into the year with a knee injury, ends up injuring his other knee, so now he's got injuries in both knees. Marshall looks solid. Lockett is not a number 1 type of receiver. He's a downfield threat. They don't really have... Who else do they have? I mean, honestly. Did you guys watch this game last night?
No, I didn't watch it last night.
It's probably for the best that you didn't, because to be honest with you, it was one of the worst games I've ever seen played.
That Bears defense is tough, though.
Yes.
We're not trying to defend the Seattle Seahawks, but that defense has stepped up.
Listen, the biggest, and this is sort of a preview to, and I actually don't even have him on my list, but Russell Wilson. How anybody can even have him as a top 10 quarterback at this point after watching last night's game, I don't understand. It was one of the worst games I've ever seen a quarterback play.
The interception and then the fumble, the next drive.
But you weren't even seeing some of the other things that were going on. I mean, yes, Khalil Mack was Khalil Mack, but he was like running into the rush. There was a play where they were on their own goal line that the pocket collapsed around him. He just, for whatever reason, he just won't get rid of the ball. And he really, really, really struggled last night. And I actually had Russell Wilson this is one I will crow about, because I had Russell Wilson as my number 1 bust, and he was going at quarterback 3. I wouldn't even put him in the top 15 at this point. You know, you guys have guys like Mahomes, Cousins, Wentz is coming back. You know, even Alex Smith has looked serviceable. Russell Wilson looks lost.
I think Deshaun Watson's the same way.
I think I'm willing to give Deshaun Watson the benefit of the doubt, because I think they have some bigger playmakers, but there's no clarity at running back. The rest wide receivers hurt. They lost Jimmy Graham. Their defense isn't that great. Their defense isn't winning them games. Russell Wilson, I'm getting out. If you can get anything for Russell Wilson at this point, I would try to get it, because to be honest, I don't know if he's hurt or what's going on. But at that game last night, I had to turn it off, because it was just every time they got the ball, he just didn't look right. So I'd be very, very careful about that. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back with a few injury concerns and the biggest surprises and busts after the first 2 weeks. We'll be right back.
This is Dylan Kleintop, and you are listening to the Fantasy Football Strategy Guide.
You can't forget it's always wasted for the...
Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Strategy Guide. I'm sitting here with Dylan Kleintop and Brian Christiana, and this is Paul Miller, and this is our September edition. We're going to do this once a month, so we'll have an October, a November, and a December edition for you. So we'll have 5 total episodes on the season. So thank you for tuning back in with us. On the second half of the show today, we're going to take a look at some of the players covering up for some people with some injuries. Who are some people that might be able to step up? We're also going to talk a little bit more about surprises and busts, and then we'll conclude the show with a look back at our Super Bowl picks and analyze how we're doing after 2 weeks. All right, gentlemen. So one of the things that I'd ask you to talk about was to take a look at a couple of people who have been injured early on in the season and some people who might step up for those individuals. So Dylan, start us off with somebody who was injured and somebody who might fill in.
All right, so he's day-to-day. Devonta Freeman, who would step up for him? Definitely Tevin Coleman. I mean, I've had him on my bench for the past couple of weeks, but he's actually put up some decent points, and I'm going to start him this week.
Well, it actually has come out that Devonta Freeman is going to miss 2 to 4 weeks. Now, let's say on the short side, he missed week 1. He's definitely going to miss at least another week. Tevin Coleman's always been one of these kind of guys that you're just expecting more from him. He has all this talent, but to be honest, last week, no Devonta Freeman, 16 carries, 107 yards, 4 catches, 18 yards. I mean, it wasn't huge, but he was definitely a factor. I think that's very interesting because this Devonta Freeman thing, say it goes a month and you've got 4 weeks of Tevin Coleman. This is why, to me, it's always so important to make sure that you're handcuffing your, top running backs. But you know what? Is Devonta Freeman done? I don't know, and it's hard to say, but you don't like to say that about people. But he's had some injuries over the last few years, and he barely made it through that first game. Misses week 2. Who knows when he's back? Is he done? I mean, that's a question we're going to have to continue looking at. Brian, who was someone that you were taking a look at?
I said Giovanni Bernard.
I think that's interesting. Joe Mixon, same type of thing, knee sprain, and he's going to be out 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So they did have the early game. So I think one of those first weeks is probably down. So he's going to miss at least 1 more week. Bernard's interesting in a PPR league though, because he is sort of a out of the backfield type of person. And honestly, I don't even know who's next up on their depth chart. To be honest, because I am unaware of, I haven't really seen anybody else this year. They've got a couple of other people, but there's a guy named Cedric Pearman. But the only 2 people who've even rushed the ball this year, other than, of course, Andy Dalton, Joe Mixon and Giovanni Bernard. So it's interesting to say. I actually went after Bernard in a couple leagues for a sort of a short-term thing. But very interesting. I think Giovanni Bernard definitely was on there. Here's my concern with Bernard, though, Brian. Have you gotten to see Joe Mixon playing?
No, I haven't watched the Bengals at all this year.
I mean, he is looking like a real stud.
Yeah.
Even, especially, last week against the Ravens, who have a fairly stout defense, Joe Mixon looked great. He had over 20 carries. My concern here is he actually had a knee procedure. And I mean, you don't like to say surgery because that implies that he's going to be out for a while. So it was like a cleanup type of thing. So who knows when he gets back? I would take a look at Bernard because I just don't think that they're going to give Mixon that full workload, especially if they're playing well. They're going to want both of these guys healthy. The guy I wanted to talk about here was for Ian's Philadelphia Eagles is Nelson Aguilar. Alshon Jeffrey really has there's been no update as far we've at least gotten an update from on Carson Wentz. So Wentz will be back. And I think Alshon Jeffrey is going to be somebody who is going to be a good player when he's available. But honestly, other than Nelson Aguilar, there's only even been a couple of people who've even caught passes at the wide receiver position.
Mike Wallace is out now.
Mike Wallace is out, and there's some conflicting reports. At first, I thought it was it was even reported by ESPN that he may have suffered a season-ending ankle injury, but now it's saying he has a fibula fracture that will at least sideline him for the next couple of weeks. Now, Dylan, I don't know if you've ever broken any bones or anything playing sports, but a fibula fracture, that doesn't sound too promising.
No, it doesn't. I tore my hip flexor back in high school, but I mean, fibula, that sounds a lot worse than I can only imagine.
But what's interesting to me is behind him, they've got Marcus Wheaton. I don't know if they are going to re-sign some of these guys or activate some guys from the practice squad. Looks like Kamara Aiken got a little bit of a run, the former Raven. He had 5 catches for the 39 yards against the Bucs. This is dire straits here for the Eagles at the receiver, and I'm actually very surprised they didn't go after Josh Gordon. The Josh Gordon would have been a perfect fit for the Eagles, especially with Alshon Jeffrey. And I mean, listen, I give all the credit in the world to Alshon Jeffrey. He played through a torn labrum last year. I mean, could you imagine as a receiver not being able to put your arm above your head, or every time you do it, you're in immense pain? So I give him a lot of credit. But at this point, there's really no clear idea when he's coming back. I would be all in on Nelson Aguilar, and he was actually one of the people that I discussed early in the season. He was my number 2 sleeper. So even though my number 1 sleeper, Jack Doyle, has underperformed, my number 2 sleeper has absolutely performed in Philadelphia. So very interesting. Nelson Aguilar, I think even when Alshon Jeffrey comes back, I think Aguilar's a pretty consistent wide receiver too. What are your thoughts, gentlemen?
I watched an Eagles game their first week, and Nelson Aguilar, he's everywhere. Like, he has safe hands. Like, he's good with his hands, and he's quick, and I like him. I don't like the Eagles, but I like Nelson Aguilar. So
what's funny is they almost ran him out of town early in his career.
Yeah, I brought that up last time, how like his first season he was dropping a lot of passes and they were just on the verge of getting rid of him. Now he established himself. When Alshon Jeffrey gets back, we'll see if who's going to be the 1, who's going to be the 2. So I mean,
and they're different types of receivers too.
I mean, Aguilar is more of a deep threat.
Deep threat, and he's a slot guy. He's played a lot in the slot, which is why I think a lot of people were down on Aguilar because they didn't know if he could play that wide receiver 2. He's more of a third guy.
Because that's more like a deep threat was your Desean Jackson type. So they were thinking right away, oh, he's going to be like a Desean Jackson. And
so anybody else here, injury concerns and players who might step up, gentlemen?
He's coming back this week, but is he going to be 100%? We don't know, but I have TJ Yeldon in for Leonard Fournette. I mean, Fournette played the first half of the Giants game, and then he didn't play at all the Patriots game. So,
interestingly enough, about Fournette is he's struggled with hamstring injuries his whole career. Do they rush him back? He was inactive Sunday. He was a game time decision, and it seems likely that he'll be back. However, with how Yeldon's playing, he's got 24 carries, 109 yards, and then 5 catches for 31 and a touchdown over the first 2 weeks, backing up Fournette. Why would you? And Fournette's great, and he's a wonderful talent, but get Yeldon more involved. I mean, they're playing great football right now.
Corey Grant's not bad. I mean, he's a good backup for TJ Yeldon.
Well, and what's interesting, too, is he has 6 catches for 56 yards on Sunday. So, I mean, they've got people there. I really agree with you here, Brian. Is he going to be 100%? But maybe even worse is maybe if they bring him back, he might only get a few carries.
Yeah.
And then do you even start him? I mean, if you have him, you would think that you would have to start him. In fact, it's funny because I had a very good friend that had an interesting dilemma last week. Aaron Rodgers was their starter, and they picked up Fitzpatrick. And, of course, they probably should have played Fitzpatrick. But, you always got to play your good players and just hope. You can't just roll the dice on people. So, very interesting. All right, so that covers some of the injured players and who some of the people that might step up and who you might want to take a look at.
I would take a look at, but I'm sorry to cut you off.
No.
I know he's very, he's drafted in most leagues, but Emmanuel Sanders is having a great year for Denver. Case Keenum's having as ESPN said this morning, he's having an average season. And they said when the Denver Broncos have an average quarterback with this team, they are a threat to win the Super Bowl. So,
well, Emmanuel Sanders right now, 14 catches, 231 and a touchdown on 15 targets. Although, interestingly enough, Demaryius Thomas, 11 catches, 81 yards, but does have 21 targets in 2 games. So that's something that you might want to think about too. Demaryius Thomas did have a couple drops on Sunday. Big drops, so he might even either be hurt or just not on the same page with Keenum. I don't know, but I do like Emmanuel Sanders in this lineup. All right, we're going to take the next segment we're going to come right into is the biggest surprises after the first 2 weeks. I think we've already mentioned a couple people that I don't necessarily want to bring back up. Those people probably would be Patrick Mahomes, which we definitely talked about. Certainly Fitzpatrick. I mean, there's no bigger surprise in fantasy football in 2018 than Ryan Fitzpatrick. I think that we're all on the same page with that. So let's talk about some of the other players who are big surprises for you guys.
One I have, Kenny Galladay. Yeah.
I love Galladay, and he flashed last year, but my only issue is how bad the Lions are. I mean, they're pathetic. It's really almost difficult to watch. What do you think about Galladay though going forward?
I was just doing like research on him, and they were saying how he was like the third receiver, but he was still getting majority of the catches. And I was looking at his points, and he averages a decent amount of points for the last 2 weeks. So I would definitely, if he's on waiver wire, I would definitely think about taking him, especially, I mean, for a bench receiver or even for the flex, like if you absolutely need a receiver for the flex.
In fantasy points, he only trails, I mean, they both have 39 points, Golden Tate, 14 for 188 and 1 for Tate, 13 for 203 and 1 for Galladay, and is actually second on the team in targets, only 7 targets behind Golden Tate. I think Galladay is making that step up to it too. Again, the issue here is the fact that all 3 of them are seeing such equal target share. I do like Galladay, though, and I think that I'm surprised that more people aren't on board with him. Only owned in 69% of leagues. I mean, whereas Golden Tate, who's similar numbers, nearly 98%. I think that number might correct itself a little bit. I think if you see Galladay, you got to go get him this week because this is going to be the last week you can do so. Brian, who's one of your biggest surprises after the first 2 weeks?
I just have the Pittsburgh Steelers in general. I mean, that Browns game, I was really surprised with Ben Roethlisberger and all the interceptions. 2 to a Denzel Ward in his first ever game. And then this preseason game against the Chiefs. I mean, the Chiefs are a tough team, but I'm just surprised by them in general.
But on a fantasy podcast, from a fantasy perspective, even in the Browns game, James Conner, big game.
Oh, that was, yeah.
Antonio Brown is Antonio Brown. And, of course, in the game against the Chiefs, anyone not named James Conner did very well. Smith-Schuster, big game. Brown, a big
Conner
game.
didn't even have he had 18 fantasy points, and that's still solid.
Absolutely. And of course, they abandoned the run because they were behind so early. So I think from a perspective of the Steelers, I mean, I don't know that you're really surprised by them, though, are you, in fantasy?
I mean, Jesse James looked good, too, so I mean...
And I think that's pretty neat that they have a tight end finally that's stepping up. One interesting thing that I do want to point out about the Steelers, gentlemen, and something that's already proved itself to be true this year, is that they play so much better at home than they do on the road.
Yeah.
The game in Cleveland was on the road. The game against Kansas City was at home. Yes, they did not prevail, and they are 0-1-1.
But they looked so good.
They looked... Their offense looked so good. I would run for the hills if you had the Steelers' defense. I can't even imagine them being rostered at this point. They can't stop anyone. They don't have any difference makers. Obviously, the loss of Ryan Shazier, who was their franchise linebacker last year, was very emotional, and not only that, irreplaceable.
Yeah.
So if you have the Steelers defense, you might want to sell on them.
Same with the Giants' passing offense.
And you know what? I'm going to cop to it. I had Eli as a sleeper this year, and I tell you what, I still have him in a league, and I will be dropping him this week. There is zero situation that I would go roll with Eli Manning at this point.
I have Odell Beckham 2 out of my 3 leagues. I mean, he's getting receptions and yards, but he hasn't gotten. I mean, I'm not going to judge him based off, but a touchdown yet.
15 catches for 162. Does have twice as many targets as the next wide receiver, which is Sterling Shepard, who, again, I'm actually surprised that Sterling Shepard hasn't done more. He was a guy I was looking at maybe picking up. Really just surprising how it's played out for them so far. I'll tell you, a guy I'm going to go with here, biggest surprises after a couple weeks, Chris Thompson for the Washington Redskins, but you could also throw in there Adrian Peterson.
Yeah.
Chris Thompson, at this point in PPR leagues, 47.1 points. Adrian Peterson with 30.6. Both of them have over 100 yards receiving. Peterson, 116, and Chris Thompson with 66 yards rushing. Definitely a guy I was very, very lucky to grab in a couple leagues. I think Chris Thompson's going to be big. And you got to realize, Alex Smith, not necessarily a deep ball passer. Very short to intermediate routes. I think Chris Thompson's going to have, as long as he can stay healthy, which has been a knock on him for a very long time, I think Chris Thompson's a guy that you got to go get. And he's certainly not available in many, if any, leagues. He's right now in 89% of leagues. But I would be trading for this guy, especially in a PPR league. I think he's a weekly starter in PPR. Well, let's move to the busts because really there's a lot of surprises, but there's equally as many busts. Dylan, start us off.
So I have 3 big names that I want to talk about: Dalvin Cook, Sam Bradford, and David Johnson. have all done nothing this season.
Let's start with Dalvin Cook. I'm curious to see what his numbers are because it hasn't been great, but it hasn't fallen off of a cliff either. I mean, 26 carries, 78 yards, not great. Hasn't found the end zone yet, but does have 9 catches for 107 yards. So he's being targeted in the passing offense. Does have 12 targets. I think something we were worried about early in the season was what would the split between Dalvin Cook and Latavius Murray be, him coming off that ACL injury. Latavius Murray has only had 15 carries and 0 targets. So I think it's still a 70-30 type split. I'm not ready to give up on Dalvin Cook yet.
I still have him starting in my league, but he just hasn't done. I mean, if he doesn't do anything for next week, I might have to either trade him away or drop him. I don't know. There's something about him. Like, I like Dalvin Cook.
Or I wouldn't trade him. I would just bench him.
I would, and I certainly wouldn't drop him at this point. But I think it's interesting, Dalvin Cook, that you have him on your bust list. I mean, he's not performed to a first round pick, but I think a bust at this point is a little tough. But hey, that's a good pick. Now, here's who I want to go to: Sam Bradford. Yes. But I don't know that many people really rostered Sam Bradford. Even in the preseason, he was 25 to 30. But he is. I mean, have you watched this guy play?
They just got blown out by the Rams.
He had like 65 yards passing last week. So I think that goes into the David Johnson conversation because they were playing from behind. They're not getting Johnson involved. Fitzgerald got hurt. They don't really have anybody else at wide receiver. I mean, how did it go so far downhill in such a short period of time is my question. Fitzgerald has 15 targets. Christian Kirk has 7, and then no one else has more than 6. And in fact, there are only 2 wide receivers on the Cardinals with a reception.
I was going to say Bryce Butler, who's on there. He just signed with the Cowboys. I mean, that's a former. The Cowboys let him go. Now he's coming back.
So there is not a whole lot to be happy about in Arizona. David Johnson, a couple not great weeks, but has found the end zone, has seen 11 targets. So he's second on the team in targets, 22 carries, 85 yards on a touchdown. I mean, after a year off, 2 tough games for them to even have that. I mean, I think I'm moving more, though, into trying to gravitate toward teams that are better. I think I'm going to start taking wide receiver 2s and 3s off of good teams as opposed to taking a 1 off a bad team. I've been burned too many times. But yeah, David Johnson, okay. But you would at least argue that we both still have him in the top 10.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I still have him starting in fantasy
right.
as well. So
I think that and maybe they had a couple of tough weeks.
They played Washington week 1.
I mean, and I'm surprised that even last week, the Rams do have a solid defense, but then it's not getting any easier for David Johnson to be home for Chicago, home for the Seahawks, and then at San Francisco and at Minnesota, and then home for Denver.
Oof.
Is it time to sell on David Johnson? I'm just saying, what can you get for this guy? Can you get a Kamara? Can you get a Le'Veon Bell? Why not? I'm just saying, I'm just throwing this out there. If I had David Johnson, I might be looking at trading him for Le'Veon Bell. Just rolling the dice, especially if you have Connor, or if they had Connor, you could probably get David Johnson for Bell and Connor. I bet you could. So very interesting.
Does anybody want David Johnson? Because I have him.
Well, hey, I might be interested in a trade.
Maybe Parker.
So it's surprising, man, and with those defenses, and even San Francisco is not terrible to the bye in week 9. I mean, some real tough defenses there, and a poor team. They could be playing from behind a lot. So David Johnson, not a bad choice there. Brian.
For busts, I mean, we talked about him a little bit, Demaryius Thomas.
Yeah, and again, he had some really rough drops last week, but Denver's not playing poorly. Keenum's probably going to get a little bit better, but are you worried about Emmanuel Sanders and Courtland Sutton kind of taking some of the targets away from Demaryius?
Yeah, I mean, Emmanuel Sanders, like we said earlier, is having a great season. And you just brought up Courtland Sutton. He's going to be a good player.
Well, he's already playing pretty well. I mean, he's already got 11 targets, 3 catches, 54 yards. That's not gonna blow anybody's mind.
For a number 3, though, that's good. And then I also include. I mean, I don't think he's having the worst season in the world, but for the expectations that everyone had for him, I have Hogan on that list.
Interesting that you bring up Chris Hogan because not only is he struggled. I mean, he did have a touchdown. He's had 2 touchdowns on the season.
Yeah.
Only 10 targets on the season, which is pretty surprising. Philip Dorsett with 14 targets, leading the New England wide receivers. But the big elephant in the room, of course,
Josh Gordon.
How's that going to work? And then you have Edelman coming back. I think
Hogan could be going from a number 1 to a number 3.
I think that Hogan probably would end up playing in the slot a little bit, but what are you going to do with Dorsett? Dorsett, 12 catches on 14 targets and a touchdown. Interesting to see how that goes. I've got a couple of guys here that I wanted to bring up. We talked a little bit about Deshaun Watson and Devonta Freeman earlier in the show, so those are 2 people I had. The 2 people I really wanted to bring up, Royce Freeman, who I happen to have in 2 leagues. And again, it's not to say that he hasn't been playing well, because he's got 23 carries, 99 yards, and a touchdown. But Phillip Lindsey bursting onto the scene, 32 total touches, a touchdown. I mean, it's really surprising that Phillip Lindsey has just burst onto the scene. And I have Royce Freeman starting in 2 leagues. Fortunately, I was able to get Lindsey in one of them, but now I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Because they're like a 50-50 split here.
That could honestly be like last season with Minnesota with the Jerick McKinnon and Latavius Murray, where it was literally going back and forth every week, and it'd be 1 week someone would get a high number, and then the other person would get a low number. And most of the time, it seemed like McKinnon got the higher number, but at the end of the season, it ended up being Latavius Murray.
And so it's really difficult. But that's the thing, guys. Royce Freeman's averaging, well over 4 yards a carry.
Yeah.
So it's not like he's playing poorly. I don't know.
It's just splitting reps.
It's very strange how this is going, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. But at this point, I'm worried. Here's my other bust, and I'm all over this. I'm telling you, get rid of Jay Ajayi. If you can get rid of him, get rid of him. Corey Clement is the guy that you want there. And even something that I thought was interesting. Now, Sproles was out last week. But did you guys watch the opening game with Philly and Atlanta? Sproles was on the field for about half of the time. So it almost seems like that Peterson does not want to go to Ajayi. And Ajayi's never proven that he could stay on the field for the entire season. I would sell on Ajayi, depending on what you could get for him.
Yeah, I mean, he had a touchdown this past week against Tampa Bay.
He has 3 touchdowns on the season. But he's basically a non-factor in the passing game. Clement with 6 targets, Sproles with 7, Ajayi with only 1. So in a PPR league, I'd rather have Clement or Sproles, to be honest with you. And if something happens that Ajayi is injured for, he left the game, he came back, he has a back injury now, he's had knee problems, long run in the Super Bowl last year. Who knows? But he's a guy I don't have in any leagues, but if I did have him, I would probably consider trying to see what you could get for him at this point. You're not going to get full value on any of these people. I also had, of course, Deshaun Watson, Devonta Freeman, and another one that I did want to mention, Duke Johnson.
From Cleveland.
I'm actually especially in a PPR league, I went on Duke Johnson for a while. Only 3 catches on the season, only 35 yards. And only 6 points. Carlos Hyde seems to be the guy there, and he's being featured in the passing game, and even Nick Chubb is getting a little bit of run there. So really kind of disappointed in Duke Johnson there.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to move to the very last segment of the show. We're just going to take a look back at our Super Bowl picks and see, because they're locked in. We're not going to change them at this point. Maybe when we get closer to the playoffs, we might revisit these. But Dylan, you started off with the Rams and the Jags. How are you looking so far?
I'm looking pretty good. Jags are undefeated. Rams are undefeated. That Jags defense they're just good in every position, but so is the Rams defense. I think if these two actually meet in the Super Bowl, I mean, they always say offense wins games and defense wins championships. It's going to be a defensive battle.
Interestingly enough here, and you guys could certainly argue with me if you don't agree with this, but arguably in power rankings right now, if you were to power rank all 32 teams, 1 and 2 right there, if you ask me. So so far so good for you, Dylan. Brian, you had the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Rams. So obviously one of those teams looking good.
Yeah.
One of them has yet to win a game.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about Pittsburgh? They got blown out, and they shouldn't have even beaten the Cleveland Browns.
Well, if I'm a Pittsburgh fan, just keep your fingers crossed.
That's all you can do.
Saying.
And of course, I'm in the worst shape at this point. The Houston Texans 0-2, and unfortunately, the New Orleans Saints. Not only did they lose their first week's game to Tampa Bay in a shootout when Fitzmagic revisited came to be, but they barely beat the Browns last week. Is it just that the Browns maybe are better than we thought?
I think the Browns might be the real. They just have to win a game. Like, I feel bad for Browns fans. They're going through a lot, but they just need to win.
What is it about New Orleans? Their offense is looking great. Their defense just can't stop anybody.
I mean, I really don't even know what to say, honestly.
And we'll continue to revisit these. But so far in the Super Bowl matchup pool, if you will, Dylan, you look like you're in the driver's seat at this point. All right, well, guys, it's been another successful edition of the Fantasy Football Strategy Guide for the month of September. We'll be back in October to talk about. We'll be about a quarter of the way through the season thus far and close to halfway through the fantasy season. We'll be back with some of these other topics, and feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you want us to talk about. All right, so for Dylan Kleintop, for Brian Christiana, this is Paul Miller, and we'll catch you next time on the Fantasy Football Strategy Guide.